may want to rethink it because of a pandemic. For example, if you had some kind of an emergency, how would you be able to maintain social distance during that? Or have you shared, I know a lot of archives and people, especially with conservation programs, shared a lot of their PPE with hospitals. You might need that. How would you replace it if needed? So the other thing to think about is that creating your emergency plan may seem like a big process, and it can be. However, you can break it down into steps, which makes it very manageable. And I think that a ton of this work can be an excellent work from home project. So if you are looking for your work from home projects for the next couple of months, this would be something to suggest. My goal is that by the end of these 5 weeks, you have a draft of your plan, although that definitely is going to depend on how much access you have to your building. But even if you don't have a draft of your plan, you should have a really solid roadmap to take to get to your plan. And we are recording these classes for future access. So if you're not in your building now, but you get to go back into your building in August, September, whenever your institution decides is right, you'll still be able to get back to that information if you want it. So my objectives, by the end of today's webinar, you're going to be able to explain the importance of emergency planning, talk about how various types of emergencies affect archival collections. You'll be able to decide who the best people to be on your emergency planning team are. You'll be able to work with first responders during the planning process. And the agenda is we'll do an introduction to emergencies, an introduction to the planning process, talk about your team. You may have stakeholders who aren't directly involved in the planning process but need to be considered. They may be excellent influencers for you, or they may be trying to exert influence over the process. We'll talk about them, and we'll wrap up by talking about working with first responders, who are really one of your key allies. I have got time set aside at the end for questions and answers. So as I talk, actually, if you have questions, please put them in the question box on your control panel. And then at the end, we'll go through and answer them all, because I want to make sure everyone gets all their questions answered. And so, without any further ado, let's go ahead and start. And I always feel like it's good to start with the very, very basic things to lay the groundwork and make sure we're on the same page. So we'll talk about some sort of generalities about emergencies, and we'll talk about what you can expect in emergencies, and we'll do some definitions so that when we are throwing words around, everyone will have the same understanding of what they mean. And one of the key takeaways from this whole series is that emergencies are not a matter of if, they are a matter of when. Sooner or later, you're going to have a disaster. And when you do, having a plan can make all of the difference. So I thought we would try something. I've never done this before in real life, but I'm going to put a poll up on the screen that asks if you've had an emergency. And if you would just check off, it's anonymous. We can't go back and look and say, ooh, that person had what happened to them. But if you would, oh, I guess I have to hit launch poll. That would help. There we go. Poll in progress. You should be seeing it on your screen. And I see we've had some small water disasters, some flooding, a lot of something else's. Gonna give it a couple seconds more to give everyone a chance. It was kind of slowed. And I don't think we had an answer. I think you're only allowed to have 5 answers in the polls. So we couldn't put an answer for nothing. So I'm going to assume that if you haven't responded, you have not had a disaster. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results with you. I think you can see the poll results. So yeah, it looks like I'm getting more than 100%. So some people have had multiple disasters and a little bit of everything. But what I'm seeing here is that the largest thing is a small water disaster, which is exactly what we would expect to see. Most emergencies, most collections emergencies are small water disasters. And if you're going to work with collections emergencies, just go with the territory. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And I think you should be seeing my screen again, but if you are not, Peggy, will you let me know?
I can see it.
Perfect. That's the first time I think either Peggy or I have done a poll. So it is very exciting to know that we can do that. And next week I have so many polls for you. So the #1 rule of emergency preparedness and response is that people are always the first priority. I'm a collections person. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a lot of you all who are here with us today are also collections people. People don't go into archives because they think they're going to get rich. They go into archives and cultural heritage because it matters to them and the material culture is important. And one of the things that means for us is we tend to just skip right over human beings and go straight to our collections. But people are always the first priority. Collections and buildings come second. And you need to make sure you understand that and explain that to everyone involved. It's particularly important when you're working with first responders to make sure that they know that you understand that their priority is human life. And we'll talk more about how first responders aren't there to save your treasures, no matter how amazing your treasures are. But if you understand their language, let them know that you understand their priorities, it may be easier to get them to help you figure out the best ways to care for your collections. So people first priority, kind of tattoo that into your brain. Remember to reiterate that to people frequently. I will try to over the course of this, but this also may be the only time you hear me say that. So remember, people, 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 people. There are 2 rules of emergencies. The first is that emergencies always happen on weekends and holidays. And I can tell you tons of those stories, like the time I spent the 4th of July on a phone with a librarian in another state whose library burned down on the 4th of July. Or some friends of mine in a municipal records office here in Texas who had an air conditioning failure over, I want to say, Memorial Day weekend, and came back in on that Tuesday to find that their entire collection was covered in mold. So always weekends, always holidays. It's never like a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon when it would be convenient. The other thing is that emergencies always happen when your key people are on vacation. Because of that, you need a team. Your team is crucial. Unless you have a team, if you're the only person in charge of emergencies in your institution, that means you do not get to go on vacation because you have to be there to help deal with the emergencies. So start thinking now about your teams. A couple of definitions to talk about. And the first two on this list are emergency and disaster. And you will hear people use them kind of interchangeably, and they're not really. When I first entered the field, everyone called it disaster planning, and somewhere in the last 10 years or so, it's made a shift, and we do tend to say more emergency planning, which I like much better, actually. An emergency is an unforeseen circumstance or occurrence that calls for immediate action. So that could include anything from life safety issues to a big flood or hurricane, or a tiny mold outbreak that could spread if you don't take action immediately. So emergency is just something that calls for immediate action. A disaster is a sudden, unplanned event that produces great material damage, loss, and distress. So fires and floods usually result in disasters because of the amount of damage they cause. And disasters can result from natural occurrences, like especially those of y'all who are perhaps on the Gulf Coast are quite familiar with the effects of hurricanes. But disasters can also be man-made, and the best example I have in recent memory of that is University of Kansas, up in Manhattan, Kansas, had a construction incident that caused their library to burn. And they are still, it's been a year and a half, I think, and they're still recovering. It was really devastating. And that one was definitely a man-made issue. So hazard is a condition that presents the potential for harm. So hazards can be natural, environmental, they can be industrial, they can be technical. It's everything from that leak in your roof to the fact that you live in Tornado Alley to the fact that perhaps you have 18 plugs in the outlet in your kitchen. Could be any of those things. And then a risk is the probability that a particular hazard will lead to injury, loss, or damage. Vulnerability is the diminished capacity of an individual or group to anticipate, cope with, resist, or recover from the impact of a hazard. So one of the ways to reduce your vulnerability is to create your emergency plan. And finally, mitigation is the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. And mitigation can happen both before and after a disaster. So buying disaster supplies, buying emergency supplies is a really good example of mitigation prior to the event. Turning off the water after you have a pipe break is a really good example of mitigation after the disaster. Oh, and Leslie wants me to repeat the definition of a disaster. So let me do that really quickly. A disaster is any sudden, unplanned event that produces great material damage, loss, and distress. So the difference between, so an emergency requires immediate action. A disaster is about the amount of damage produced. And Anton wants to hear vulnerabilities again. Vulnerability is the diminished capacity of an individual or a group to anticipate, cope with, resist, or recover from the impact of a natural or man-made hazard. All righty. So here comes the big fun, talking about types of emergencies. We're going to go through some of the common types of emergencies you might encounter. And one thing I think is important to point out is when you are talking to people who do a lot of emergency work, you hear them talk a lot about the big one, right? We love to talk about the impacts of a Hurricane Katrina or a huge fire or what happened in that tornado because it's exciting. It's kind of our version of watching the towering inferno. But so we'll talk about what could be really, really terrible. But the thing that you should remember when we're doing this is that the thing to remember is that most of your disasters that you encounter over the course of your career will be small water disasters. So even though we're talking big and planning big, most of what you're going to be dealing with is much smaller. And we always start with floods because water emergencies are the most common emergencies. And look at this. This is, I believe people have brought books out of this library to start to dry, but this is a pretty bad, disgusting flood. It's the kind of picture you choose because it makes people go, bleh. So obvious things that happen when you get a flood. Materials get wet, and that can vary widely. Paper reacts differently. Different kinds of paper just do different things. It's fascinating. Some, excuse me, some paper you can soak for hours and it barely gets damp, especially if you're dealing with books. Others will soak up gallons of water very quickly. If you've got an old phone book hanging around and want to do a fun science experiment, throw your phone book in a sink full of water for half an hour and see how big and heavy and wet it gets. Donna, can we table that question until next? So Donna wants to know if BMS Cat is pretty much the only game in town for getting outside vendors assistance. And I want to table that question until next week when we're talking about that, if that's okay. Excellent. Thanks, Donna. So, okay, so materials, soak your phone book. Water is very heavy. That means that materials can expand. It's really, if they expand enough, they will pop off of shelves. Luckily, you all are archivists, so a lot of your materials will be in boxes, and those boxes will provide some protection. But if it's a long enough disaster or a long enough water event, your boxes may get soaked through as well. You also want to consider your health hazards because flood water is not nice, clean tap water. Flood water has dirt and potentially industrial contaminants and chemicals, potentially sewage in it. So it's dirty and disgusting. You also don't want to mess around with power and standing water because that can shock you. And if things are wet long enough, mold can grow, and mold is a health hazard. If you have never been exposed to mold and you don't have any kind of a reaction to it, you can develop that kind of a response to mold after exposure, and it will affect your respiratory system. It's not good for you, so you want to be very careful anytime you're dealing with mold and dirty water, etc. Moving on to fire. Fires cause soot and burning and charring, and of course they cause water damage, because how do we put fires out? We put fires out with water. Fire hoses that your fire department is going to use spray water at 150 pounds per square inch and 1,250 gallons a minute. That is enough to blow boxes off of shelves, and it's enough to damage paper, tear paper, deform any kinds of books that you have. So that's a good reason to know your first responders, and we'll talk about that at the end of the day. Because if your first responders know you, they can tailor their response, excuse me, and perhaps not have as much damage to your collections. If you are lucky enough to have a sprinkler system, that's great because it will put a fire out quickly. But sprinklers release 15 gallons a minute per sprinkler head. And the average time once a fire is out that it takes people to figure out how to turn their sprinklers off is 45 minutes. That ends up being 675 gallons of water per head, which is an awful lot of water. So your takeaway there is that you need to know how to turn your sprinklers off to prevent that water. Earthquakes are becoming more likely in Texas due to fracking. And there was a significant earthquake in Cleburne a few years ago. This is Haiti after their big earthquake, and their shelves just went down like dominoes. And yeah, if you have an earthquake, you can have boxes falling off shelves, you have fragile artifacts that are breaking, pipes that can break. And if your pipes break, what kind of a disaster is it? It's a water disaster, because they're all water disasters. Unless your gas pipe breaks, and then you have potential for a natural gas explosion. So yeah. And then mold. I always like to talk about mold because it may not be a disaster, but it is definitely an emergency in the sense that you need to act quickly if you find a mold outbreak, because it can become much worse very quickly. The rule of thumb with mold is that it happens when your relative humidity is over 65% for 48 to 72 hours or longer. And the warmer it is, the more quickly your mold will grow, and the more quickly it will spread once it's growing. Mold is definitely bad for your collections. It is also definitely a health hazard. I did not take it seriously at the beginning of my career, and now I'm extremely vulnerable to mold. That is not why I'm coughing this morning. I think it's because I haven't really talked for more than a couple of minutes in 2 months, and my voice is warming back up. But yeah, if I go into a room that's moldy, immediately my throat starts to just kind of close up. And we'll talk in a couple of weeks about the personal protective equipment you need to protect yourself from mold. And then other types of emergencies you might deal with: insect infestations, small water leaks, severe weather, hazardous materials accidents, so many more: terrorism, vandalism, radiation accidents. Next week, we're going to do risk assessment. That's going to be the biggest part of what we're talking about. And that's how you figure out what is most likely to affect your collections. But you can begin to think now about what you might be most worried about. And it's good to know what emergencies and disasters are most likely to be yours, because that's what you're going to plan hardest for. If you live in Wichita Falls, you're probably not going to be doing much hurricane planning, for example. Sorry, I thought I had myself muted before that. So one more thing to remember. Yes, we like to talk about the huge disasters. Mostly you're going to experience small water disasters, although everything is bigger in Texas, so don't count your chickens on that. If it's a huge disaster, you may potentially be able to get help from many sources, which we'll talk about next week. So don't assume you will be out of luck, even if it's something Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma sized. But the most important thing you can do now is to plan, because a plan will make your chances of recovery much greater. So that leads us to the planning process. And what's the planning process like? We're going to talk about, this whole series is the planning process in general, but I think it's useful to at least show you the roadmap now, so you know where we're going with it, and then each week we'll drill a little farther down into each section. So the very, very, very first thing you need when you are writing an emergency plan is support from your administration. As you're going to see soon, creating and maintaining an emergency plan can be a pretty big undertaking. And if you don't have support at the upper levels of your administration, chances are it's going to go to the bottom of your desk, because there are going to be other priorities that your big bosses have for you. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you probably already have plenty of work on your plate already without adding something else like this, if you don't already have an emergency plan. So make sure before you dive into this that you have support from your administration. The next thing you're going to do is establish your team. And when you do that, you're going to be thinking about the best people to help you create your plan. You might have some ideas in mind. You might be trying to figure out who you're going to ask. We'll talk about that in a very few minutes. Step two is doing some research, which we'll talk about next week. At this point, emergency planning is a pretty well studied field for cultural heritage, especially when it comes to collections. We know a ton about it. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's easier to plan if you know how others have planned before you, and you can just choose what you like from their work and borrow it. Also next week, and I promised you this earlier, we're going to do risk assessment, where you're going to figure out exactly what could go wrong with your building, with your collections, with your people. And again, this isn't something you have to do from scratch. We're going to talk about a really, really good tool that you can use that will guide you through the whole process. I'm not going to say it'll be easy, because it takes some effort and some commitment to do, but it's incredibly doable. After you've done all that, you get to write your plan. And this is weeks 3 and 4. You'll talk about your contacts, procedures, salvage priorities. All of the different components of the plan come together. And step 5 is when you implement your plan, which we'll talk about the last week. This is when you purchase your supplies because you need to have some disaster supplies on hand. You train your staff, and what this picture is showing is a training exercise that the National Archives did. It's a wet salvage of some photos and other paper material. So you're going to think about how to train your staff so that they know what your emergency plan is like. And you are going to keep your plan updated because things change, and a plan that is 5 or 6 years old may be not very useful. So away we go with your team. Writing an emergency plan is just too big a job for one person. Plus, you can't, remember how we said earlier that emergencies always happen when your key people are on vacation or on having a holiday? Yeah, if you can't keep that information centered in one person, it needs to be shared widely. So you need a team for your emergencies. The key is the team, and the people that you're going to have on your team are usually going to be people from each department. You need people from each department because you have somebody out in each department that can bring knowledge about that department back to the planning process, but that also gives you conduits to transmit knowledge back to those departments. So somebody from every department if you are an institution large enough to have multiple departments. And if you're a very small institution, it may end up that everybody, if there's only 5 people working in your institution, it may be that everybody in your institution is part of your emergency team. You also want people from building services if you have a building services department. If all of that is contracted out, that's a little different situation, and we'll talk about that later. But building services are the people who understand how the building works. They're the ones who can deal with your HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems for you. They're the ones who have access to tools. They may be the ones who have access to buckets and shovels and generators and the best lines on getting fans and other heavy equipment like that. So you want them on your team. If you have a security department, they are crucial for guarding your building if something happens to make it more vulnerable during a disaster. Like I sometimes teach a tabletop exercise that imagines there is an explosion in a building that knocks out the big plate glass windows in the lobby. So your security team is who you would talk with about securing your building so that you don't have random thrill seekers and looters coming in and trying to get to your collections. Your IT staff are crucial both for making sure that your important data is backed up. And we're living in a really good time for emergencies in a way, because hopefully at this point everyone has good backup plans for their data, and we don't have to worry so much about making sure that is retrievable. In the olden days, before we had computers, we had to worry about getting all of our data out of the building, and the joke is that every librarian had trays assigned to, or drawers assigned from the card catalog that they pulled out and took on their way out of the building. If your IT staff are doing their job, you don't have to worry about that, and you want them on the team. They're also people who will be responsible for setting up computer access if you don't have access to your building for a while. So you need them on the back end as well. Communication staff are going to be very important for communicating to the public. So you want to have the person who updates your social media might be on your team, the person who runs your website, so that you can let people know what's going on. And you might also think about who would be the best press spokesperson too. We'll talk about who that might be, I think, next week. You definitely want to have communications looped in. And finally, your first responders, who are usually police, fire, usually in our situation. And they aren't technically on the team because they don't work for you, but they are a very useful person to bring into the planning process early. Invite some of your meetings, get to know them, because they can provide a lot of useful information. And if they understand your collections, they have a better chance at saving them for you. So those are all the people that you need. And then you need a backup for every person on your team. And that's so you can go on vacation. So you need a backup so you can go on vacation, but also people don't stay at the same job or even in the same position forever. So you need a backup to be available when people move on. When you're starting out, you may think hard about who are going to be the best people to bring on your team, and say, I want Susie because I know she's super organized, and I want Jane because she's our conservator and I know she understands how to handle collections. Later on, after this, you might want to write team membership into job descriptions so that when people take new jobs and you hire new folks, they know going in that they're going to be on the emergency team, and that's just set the person who is in this position is on the emergency team, and it just perpetuates itself. You also need support from the upper levels of your administration, even if they aren't on the team, which we talked about earlier. And very, very, very important, you need to have somebody who can facilitate access to money, because emergencies are not cheap. If you have if you have a small water disaster, hopefully you just have supplies on hand to take care of it. But if you have a large water disaster, you may need cash quickly to run down to Costco and buy all the paper towels. Or you may need somebody who can authorize large expenditures, so you can hire someone like BMS Cat or Polygon or Munters to come in and do a big mold remediation for you. So whoever can help you get your hands on money is a really important person to have on your team. You also may have stakeholders who are interested but not on the team. And the definition of a stakeholder in this context is anyone who may be interested in your plan or have input to offer. So stakeholders are very useful potentially when you encounter resistance. The stakeholder may be able to make the case to whoever is being resistant more effectively than you can. I especially am interested in getting stakeholders involved if it's some kind of a community archives. I first started thinking about them about stakeholders when I was doing a version of this class for Native American tribes. And in those contexts, stakeholders are the ones who get a lot of the actual roadblocks cleared. So if you're having roadblocks, stakeholders may be exactly the right person to go to. Your boss is resistant, so you find somebody that can influence your boss to talk to your boss. They may also have insights into salvage priorities and other parts of your emergency plan. And you may have some stakeholders that are there because they have experience with planning and emergencies and may be able to offer you some really good advice. So if those are people are on your list, that is fantastic. Ways to engage with stakeholders. Informal one-on-one chats, like in the hall or over coffee, can be the most useful for just gathering quick information and getting a sense of how things are going. But you can also do formal interviews. If there is somebody that has specific information you're trying to get, sit them down with a list of questions and interview them. And you may also decide that group meetings, like a kickoff event, are useful. Well, they're useful for disseminating information. They're useful for getting a read of the room and getting an idea of how people feel about the process. And they might be interesting for bringing in new ideas. So if you have a lot of stakeholders that you're interested in catering to, you might hold a kickoff. And I don't think either Peggy or I told you that you have a set of handouts that you can access from the control panel. It's down at the bottom above chat. It says handout packet. There, didn't need to get rid of that. That you have a copy of the slides if you want those. You have a resource list, and you also have this worksheet, which may or may not be useful, but it's something I threw together a while ago. And if it is useful for helping figure out who should be on your team, you do have it. And if you want it as an editable document, you can just shoot me an email. My email is in the packet, and I will get you that as something editable as well. I think it's just a Word document. So you can sit there and figure out who's on your team. I have 5 team members on this, plus a team leader. And I think that you probably don't want your team to be much larger than that, because the larger it is, the harder it is to coordinate. So I like the idea of 5 plus some backups and call it good. So that's your team. And let's talk a bit about working with first responders, who are just amazing. First responders for our purposes are really police and fire departments. They can also be, if your security is an external security company, it could be your security team. But for collections context, we really think a lot about the fire department. Your fire department is going to go into your building, and so has a stake in your planning. And one of the most instructive stories I have ever heard, thank goodness this is not my story, it's someone else's, but I'm going to tell it to you all because I love it. There was a museum in this great state that had some very poor planning in their kitchen. And to plug in the coffee pot, you had to drape the cord of the coffee pot across the electric stove. Yes, I know. It's a terrible idea. I don't know how it happened. It was fine until one day somebody hit the burner controls, and turned the burner on very low, which then caught the cord on fire. And the fire wasn't a lot of damage, but it did release a ton of smoke, and the smoke got into the HVAC system, and the fire department came to visit. And yeah, it was not much of a fire. But what the fire department told them was that they had no idea what that institution was about. And it was very useful for them to see the inside of the building. Like a lot of places, it was big, expansive, open spaces in the front, but then the back of house was a rabbit warren of cubbyhole offices and storage spaces and hallways and corridors. And what the fire department told the staff at this museum was that had they not seen the backstage of this building and known what they were getting into, it would have been very difficult for them to rescue anybody trapped there in a real fire. So bringing your fire department in so they understand you is crucial. Yeah, it's crucial for your collections. It's also crucial for the safety of your staff. So before an emergency, your archives and local museums and libraries and historic sites and et cetera, hold the collective history of the community. Your artifacts, your documents, your structures are irreplaceable. Collections often have a high monetary value, both in the money that it would cost to replace them, if they were replaceable at all. In a couple weeks, we'll talk about salvage priorities. And I always throw out the Ransom Center in Austin's Gutenberg Bible as an example of something that could be replaced, because there are more, but it would be really expensive to replace it, so we don't want to have to. So that's something with a high monetary value that's replaceable. But also, cultural heritage institutions bring in a lot of tourist dollars, and they contribute to the economies of their communities. Like you're in a county clerk's office, all those people who come to use your records stop on the county square where you're located for lunch and pump that $20 that they pay for lunch back into the local economy. So that's important. And the other thing is that visitors to cultural institutions can be at risk during emergencies just as much, if not more so, than staff, because visitors won't know the exit routes. They're probably not stopping and looking at your emergency exit maps on their way in the building. So you want to make contact with your first responders beforehand so that they know what they're dealing with. I highly recommend taking the FEMA Incident Command Training course, and we're going to talk about what that means on the next slide. But it will help you have the same language as your first responders, which is very useful. I also recommend that you designate one primary contact. Your fire department doesn't want to hear from every single person on your disaster team. They want to talk to one person every time, with potentially one backup in case something happens to that one person. That just keeps they're busy people, that keeps all the communication very streamlined and hopefully not a pain in the neck. Ask your fire department for help creating your plan. They will have so many ideas about human safety. And invite them over for a walkthrough of your building. And I'm going to just tell you, I guess a year ago, I got to go, it had been a while since I'd gone on a fire department walkthrough of a building, and I was in a little teeny tiny museum and archives in Oklahoma. They invited the local fire department to come over when I was there, and we all walked through together. It was incredibly instructive for me to see all the things the fire department could point out, that there was no way that anybody who wasn't the fire marshal could know. It was things like, you need to have an extra emergency exit sign over here, or you don't have enough fire extinguishers in this corridor because they need to be X number of feet apart. So that was useful for helping figure out how to make the building safer. And we were all very excited that we'd done that. But also, the fire department had no idea of what kind of materials this building had, and they were thrilled to get to see them and really walked away going, oh wow, this is something important that we need to have on our radar. And they were really happy to see again the fact that, yeah, it had nice gallery space in the front of this building, but then the back, I was there for 2 days and I never figured out how to get from one place to the other. So imagine if it's dark and there's a fire and you've never been in the building before. So invite your fire department over for a walkthrough. I do from time to time hear people more on the museum side of the work that I do saying, oh, we don't want them to come over because it's so bad. But I am here to tell you that if it is so bad that you can't have the fire marshal walk through with you, A, it is probably too dangerous for you to be in that building. B, they're going to come through at some point anyhow, and there's every chance you could get fined or shut down. They would rather you call them and help figure out a plan to bring everything into alignment with safety codes. So make them your ally, make them your friend. They are wonderful. So now on to the incident command system, which is basically a universal language for emergency responders. It's part of the National Incident Management System, which is like a 70-page document. You can find it online and read it. It's not that boring. But NIMS represents and this is, quote, a core set of doctrine, concepts, principles, terminology, and organizational processes that enables effective, efficient, and collaborative incident management. ICS, which is the Incident Command System, is the incident management structure. So what you really need to take away from that is there are a lot of acronyms, NIMS and ICS and this and that, but also you need to take away that everyone who works in emergency response uses this structure. So yes, the fire department uses it. Yes, the National Guard uses it. But also the Red Cross uses it. And a lot of more civilian-oriented response groups. So everyone uses this command system. Everyone understands the language. So if you understand the language, you are in a good position to work with people. So this, oh, there we go. Up, down, arrow, down, arrow, they all look the same. This is the most basic version of ICS. It's going to get more complicated in a minute, but I think you can probably see my mouse. So at the top, you have an incident commander who is in charge of the whole thing. Your incident commander may or may not be the head of your institution. Depending on your incident and your organizational structure, your incident commander might be the head of your disaster team and not the archives director or the university president or the mayor or whatever structure you're working under. There are a few people who report directly to the incident commander. There's a public information officer who provides information to the public. Pretty easy. There's a safety officer who is responsible for safety on the disaster site. Disaster sites are notoriously dangerous, and we don't want anybody getting more injured because A, we don't want people getting injured, but B, if somebody gets injured on our disaster site, we have to stop what we are doing to recover from our disaster to take care of that person who is injured, and it just slows everything down. So we want everyone safe, safe, safe. And then there's a liaison officer who can be a liaison with other groups. Underneath that, we have an operations section and the section chief. Operations are, I like to think of them as the people who do the work. So in an archives disaster, the operations section would be probably the people doing the actual salvage. Those are the people who are opening the boxes and laying things out to dry and deciding what you're going to get rid of and making and keeping all those records. The planning section determines how everything is going to run. So they're the ones who say to the operations section, the first thing you're going to do is get our rare documents, and the last thing we're going to deal with if we have enough time is our newspaper that's already been digitized. Logistics is the group responsible for providing supplies, workers, medical tents if you have a big enough disaster, snacks. Logistics are the snacks people, which is very important. Everyone likes snacks. If you've ever been on a disaster site, you will find that people will always be offering you snacks. You need snacks to get through it. And then there's finance and administration. Finance and administration are responsible for money, and they're responsible for record keeping. Like, for example, one of the things they would need to keep track of is time and volunteer time, because if you have a disaster and you're going for FEMA money, there is a match that you have to put up, but a lot of that match can be in volunteer time. So your administration section keeps track of how much money or how much time people are spending so they can convert that to dollars for your FEMA match. Just one little thing they take care of. So that's kind of the very basics of ICS. This is the deeper dive, and I'm not going to dive terribly deep into this because honestly, can I tell you the difference at this point between a strike team and a task force and a single resource? No, because I haven't taken the training in a year or two, and if you're not using it, that vocabulary just disappears. But it gets complicated. And yeah, so you can see over here in logistics, there's communications, there's medical, there's food, there's ground support, facilities, supplies, all of these people coming together to handle a disaster. And there are some more principles. There's the idea that you only report to one person. So I'm the director of the communications unit. I report to the head of the service branch. The head of the service branch reports to the head of logistics, who reports to the incident commander. And there's also a limited scope of how many people you're supposed to be supervising. I believe the number is 5. That you shouldn't be really supervising more than 5 people, because that's how many one person can supervise effectively. So the big takeaway from this is that you should take FEMA's ICS training, which is on you. There's a link to it on your resource list. It'll take you, if you do ICS 101, it'll take you about an hour or so, maybe an hour and a half. You'll get a fancy little certificate you can print out and hang up at on your bulletin board or put in your personnel file. And there's a level after 101 that's also useful to take. And it's a good idea to take them every year or two, because you do forget the finer points of the language. I'm not going to lie and tell you that it'll be fun and exciting, because it's not. It's government stuff. But if you're doing work from home right now and you are looking for things to do to give yourself a break from updating metadata, taking ICS 101 would be a really good way to spend a little time. And then I just wanted to show you, right, the ICS chart, this one, that's a huge organization or multiple organizations working together. You might be a tiny institution with only half a dozen or 10 people working for you. You might want a very simplified ICS. It's still useful to have some kind of a command structure. And this is one that I just threw together for a very small institution. You've got your incident commander who runs everything, planning and operations who plans and coordinates your salvage efforts, logistics who are arranging for supplies and for meals and for volunteers, and then finance and administration. So theoretically, your ICS would be 4 people, plus whoever they're supervising who's doing this work. So it's very scalable. It can work at very small scales, but it also works at very, very large scales. And then, oh, this is my last slide before we have time for questions and answers. Yay. But the last thing I wanted to talk with you about working with your first responders is thinking about putting a Knox box on your building if you don't have one already. Knox boxes are great for a few reasons. One is that they give you a really good way to make contact with your first responders. Another is that they're good for building safety. And what they are these little boxes that you can see on the screen. Yeah, they're tiny, 4 inches by 5 inches by, what is it, like 3? Yeah, 4 inches by 5 inches by 3 inches. They mount to the side of your building unless you're building a building, and then you can have it built in. And you put your key in, or you can put a key card in. And your fire department is the only people who have the magic tools that it takes to open one up. So your firefighters, if they have to get into your building, they can just use the Knox box, and it is faster than trying to cut down the door with a hatchet. And if you're in any kind of a historic building, your doors may be one of your most important historic features. They won't have to be ruined so the fire department because the fire department has to hatchet through them. They are remarkably inexpensive for the value you get out of them. It's like $330 for this model. You buy it once. It's a one-time thing. So think about installing a Knox box if you don't already have one. And that leads us to questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them. In the question box or in the chat box, either way. So Becky says, if there are only 5 staff members, how would I spread out duties? And That's a really interesting question, and it's kind of a tough one for me to answer because I don't know what everyone's strengths are. I would definitely, on my team, we'll talk next week much more about what the process is, the researching, um, choosing a plan template and all that. I would think about who are good researchers that I could assign to research. I would think about who might be really good liaisons to work with your external building services, like the person who does your HVAC and your carpenter and your plumber and all of that. I would think about who knows the collections best, because that person might be the best person to think about salvage priorities. And yeah, that's what comes to me off the top of my head. But if you want to get into it in more detail, Becky, I would invite you to send me an email and we can talk much more about your specifics and what might make sense for you. If that helps. And Stephanie wants to know the definition of mitigation again. Let me get back to that so I say it correctly. So mitigation is the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. And mitigation can happen both before and after a disaster. So the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. Excellent, Phyllis. You can have questions whenever you want, and I'm glad you're coming back. Well, okay, so Donna wants to know if staff members need to know how to turn off sprinklers, or should that be left to first responders? And I would say it would be a really good question to discuss with your first responders. I would want someone on your staff to know how to turn off your sprinklers, and it might not be the archivist, it might be the person who's responsible for taking care of the building. But I think I would not necessarily want to leave that to first responders, or I would at least discuss it with my first responders to see if it's something that they mind you knowing. And Donna also wants to know if we're going to talk more about disaster supplies. And yes, we are, in gory detail in week 4, because disaster supplies are the shopping part, and the shopping part is the funnest part of the whole thing. And Donna, when you're saying remote monitoring, what kind of remote monitoring are you thinking about? Okay, so remote monitoring for temperature and relative humidity, which is something I think people are thinking about these days. And there are several models of data logger that actually do use Wi-Fi and Bluetooth to allow you to monitor from afar. I believe that the PEM, the Preservation Environment Monitor works, that has an option. The one I always recommend is the Hobo from Onset Technologies. I'm sorry, Onset Comp, yeah. Onset Computers, onsetcomp.com. I use Hobo because they are inexpensive comparatively and easy to use. And there is a new data logger just out on the market. It's so new that I don't even remember its name. But if you are interested, I'm sure I can track it down for you. Justin says that at UNT they use a great system called wireless tags. I don't know that one at all, but I will look it up, and I'm always happy to hear a great new monitoring system. And Donna, yes, they also report humidity. Ooh, we love backlog data for years, and we love inexpensive. Where did you get them? Do you remember? Wirelesstags.com. Cool, thank you. So I'm just gonna also put that down in the chat. So everyone else can see it and make sure. All righty. If there aren't any more questions, and it looks like questions have slowed down. I love questions. We'll have time for questions every week. And you can also reach me during the week. But in theory, part of the idea between this series is you can do a little work on your plan each week, and by the time we're done, you are close to finished. So this week's homework is pretty easy. You're just going to make sure you have approval from your administration and that buy-in if you don't already. I'm hoping that if you are spending work time here, you already have that approval, that buy-in. And figure out who's going to be on your team and get them to be on your team. So this week, not a ton of homework. Next week, I will load you up. This week, it should be pretty darn doable. And with that, that's everything I've got. So there's my email address. You are more than welcome to email me this week as you're doing this and have questions. I am here to help you all. And really and truly, especially now, getting email makes me feel very important and popular. So don't hesitate to shoot me an email. And I think, are you getting ready to jump in, Peggy?
I am. I was just
Excellent.
wrapping up here, and there may be one other question from Donna. Let's see, she was wondering if she can share this webinar link with other potential team members, and absolutely. So share away. We will have this posted on our THRAB website, and we'll send the link out to you all. I know a lot of people weren't able to actually attend live today. So if you want to leave, you just go to File and Leave, and we will see you here next week.
Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Have a good rest of your day.